Hi everyone, it's Ryan here. Welcome to my room, guys. Hope you're doing well. Before I get started with this video, just a quick reminder that if you're interested in purchasing my book, The Interview, if you're into Kafka, Dostoevsky, Albert Camus, Hermann Hesse, and all these wonderfully interesting people, link down below to purchase on Amazon, less than $10. Very psychological book. Support a fellow INFJ. Thank you. So, I like to return to the topic of humor from time to time because it's an endlessly interesting topic, and there's so much to say about it, and it reveals so much about a person's personality, but also like maybe more broadly speaking, a type's sort of personality spectrum, and it really interests me how INFJ humor manifests itself and it differs from certain other types of humor. And maybe because a lot of my friends are INFP types, two of my best friends are INFP types, my brother is an INFP as well, so I will be very familiar with the INFP humor, and I think that the INFP approach to humor can be contrasted with the INFJ approach to humor. In fact, that can in a sense be a way for you to, again, tell the difference. If you're trying to figure out whether you're an INFP or an INFJ, that could be a way to look at it. How do you manifest humor? How do you react to humor? That kind of thing. And so I think that I will try to look at mainly two broad aspects. So first I'll discuss those two types' reaction to humor and to jokes, and secondly I will look a bit more into how these types come up with jokes, or how do they manifest the humor. So instead of how they react, it's more like how they create the humorous situation, or the humorous saying. So first the reaction, and then the proaction, if you like. Now, in terms of the reaction to humor, and particularly to, I would say, provocative humor or offensive humor, those two types have quite different approaches, really, which comes from the FINE of the INFP, sort of contrasting with the NIFE of the INFJ. Meaning that both types can be offended by certain types of humor, or both types can, surprisingly or not, enjoy certain types of humor, including provocative humor. Because the way, like sometimes you want to say something a little provocative, and that with a certain kind of audience it would work, but you're not sure if it would work with a type of audience that you're maybe a little bit less familiar with. And the fact of the matter is, there's no knowing in advance whether the joke will be received well by determining or knowing in advance the type of the person. You could have a person could be INFP, and you could offend them with the exact same joke as you would offend an INFJ. Or you could offend the INFJ but not the INFP, or the reverse, or you'd offend neither. All right, so it's not really the kind of joke. It's has more to do with the particular characteristic of the person in question. In the INFP, it will tend to depend on the kind of personality they have, the kind of values that they hold, what they consider to be acceptable, what they consider not to be acceptable. But it comes very much from their subjective perception of these things. So how they will react to your joke, to your sense of humor, will be determined by the kind of INFP that they are. If they are a person who tends to hate any kind of provocative humor because it could be seen, for example, as making fun of people who can't defend themselves, or as being mean in a kind of way, a bit cold or heartless or callous, well, the INFP will be offended. And if they're not that kind of person, they will not be offended. And it's as simple as that most of the time. And you sort of need to get to know the person before you can figure this out. And in the case of the INFJ, it's actually quite different because, first of all, the INFJ is an FE user. So they don't have the strongest FI. And typically their response to humor will not come from their subjectivity. Because of FE, they will have a tendency to react to your jokes in a way that is diplomatic. If they don't find it funny, if they find it a bit offensive, they will, more often than INFPs, they will be tempted to let you know indirectly or with tact. And it's for you to kind of pick up, the message that you just received. It's possible that, if they're very offended, they will express it more vocally, but if they do, it's not going to be along the lines of the INFP, where the INFP will say something like, oh, like, that's a really dickish thing to say, I really don't like you saying this, please don't say that. INFJ, if they channel their offense into reproach, they will usually do it the ENFJ way, by, referring back to principles, referring back to norms. That's the FE speaking, the external FE speaking, the objective FE speaking, where they will say, well, in the world nowadays, for X and Y reasons, it's not appropriate to say this or that. So it really depends on the kind of atmosphere they're in, both in the room, maybe in the wider context in which they are, maybe the country. It will also depend on the country where they are. So it's all a matter of the context in which they are and whether the joke can be fitted within that context and still be acceptable, okay? And what kind of external set of norms they have chosen for themselves. But they will not typically not express, react well or not well, depending on subjective principles, essentially. Which doesn't mean that they can't have like an individual response to the joke. It's just more the judgments that, the F judgments that sort of channels the response according to subjectivity in the case of the INFP or objectivity in the case of the INFJ. Now, to move on to how people come up with jokes and how people express their sense of humor, manifest their sense of humor. Here again, there is a difference, but it's connected with the use of functions once again. So I just want to remind you that if you want to understand MBTI and personality theory better, if you want to develop a good understanding, please study the functions, because this is how you will have that understanding, that how you will get to that understanding, and it will multiply how much you understand. Well, in the case of the INFP, it's actually quite similar to how they react to things. And I think that it is actually almost more interesting to contrast the INFP manifestation of humor with the ENFP manifestation of humor, because in one case you've got an FINE, in the other case you've got NEFI. The manifestation of the INFP's humor will be through judgments, which means that a lot of what is funny about the INFP's humor is the particular kind of observations that they make on things, and they will be unusual observations, so they will add a twist to the observations that makes the observations funny. A good example of that is the now controversial figure Louis C.K. He would talk about topics of the everyday, but he just have a perspective on it that just is hilarious. Well, used to be, or maybe still is for some people. So that's kind of the, you take a particular set of events. Now you present them in a way that is any oriented, so they can be put together in ways that are creative, but it's mostly the judgment that comes on top of that is creating the humor. In the case of the ENFP, the humor comes from that too, obviously, because the functions are similar, but it tends to be less about the judgments, what is said, and the observation that comes from the speaker, the subjective perception of the speaker, but more how the events themselves are brought together and combined together in these unusual ways. And I think that a very good example of that is the character of Jeremy from Peep Show, the British, amazing British show Peep Show. If you look at Jeremy, it's not so much about the judgments he makes, you know, it's more about how he associates these widely separate and variegated ideas and brings them together. And it's just like, in a way, he lets you make the judgment and find it funny then for yourself. He just presents this amalgamation that is unexpected, okay? And that's because they're dominant intuitives. And in fact, in the case of the INFJ, the humor is a little bit similar. But I think that there's also big differences which probably work against the INFJ a little bit when it comes to making like a whole room laugh. I mean, INFJs can be very funny, obviously, and they have, I think, in many cases, a wicked sense of humor. But you will notice that a lot. If you look at like famous stand-up comedians, for example, you know, comics of all kinds, the majority of them are P types. There's a lot of ENFP and INFP types. Of course, there's also, you know, ENTP types, for example, like Bill Hicks. But just to stay focused on ENFPs and INFPs, you'll notice that like almost all of them are basically, or you know, in other cases ESTPs, you know, but P types and especially not a lot of INFJs. So why is that the case? Well, my theory is, whereas I just explained that in the case of the INFPs, the judgment they have on the events that is funny, in the ENFP is it's how they bring certain like apparently very separate events together that is funny. You can still recognize the events and you can still identify the events straight away, and that's because the perception is extroverted, so it's about objectively the outside world. The problem with the INFJ, if you can call it that a problem, is that, well, like the ENFP, their humor will be, I mean, their FE plays a role, you know, they try to get a sense of what the audience is going to resonate with, and they keep an eye on that when they narrate their joke, for example, or their observation. But still, the joke is mostly channeled through NI, and the thing about it is that NI does not manifest observation in the same way that, like, let's say, dominant NE does. Dominant NE will present you with a set of circumstances which is haphazardly brought together, and but you still see the link, and that's funny. Problem with NI is that it does that, but you don't see the link. Usually it's only the INFJ themselves who sees the link, and it makes them laugh, but the others don't get it because they're like, the connection is subjective. Right? If you hear a subjective judgment from an INFP, you can still appreciate it because it's their judgment and you can understand it, and it makes you laugh because it's incongruous, for example, or unexpected. But if it's the very association of ideas, like the very perception that is subjectively presented, like people might not get it. And so it will be funny to some people because they won't get it in a way. They will vaguely have an idea of like what the INFJ came up with, but they still won't really get it. And so that might make some people laugh, or some people might just be baffled, you know. But the INFJs will enjoy themselves very much, and then via FE they'll know this is the audience not really getting it, and they'll start feeling a bit embarrassed sometimes. A lot of the time, the ones that will find the joke hilarious, as you can expect, is the INFJs themselves, because they are NI users too, and somehow they can relate to that, you know. And I think that's certainly the kind of situation I have found myself in over the years, and a lot of, I think, INFJs that I know can find themselves in similar situations. Like they're kind of like you know, they have these mysterious ways of expressing humor that people don't necessarily get straight away, and people are more amused by the INFJ themselves being amused by it than they are sometimes by the observation. But that comes down to being an NI dominant versus NE dominance, or FI dominant with any auxiliary. So that would be some, I think, of the big differences in terms of like how INFPs, ENFPs and INFJs relate to humor. But let me know what you think in the comments, guys. See you soon.